This video is going to look and sound a little different from my usual content because this topic is serious, complex, and infuriating. It's also incredibly long, as you've probably noticed, but it is necessary to understand the full picture. As we're going through this story, I want you to keep this one simple question in the back of your mind. When was the last slave freed in America? 1865, at the end of the Civil War. Everyone knows that. That's probably the second easiest elementary school history question I could possibly think of. Well, okay, if you want to get technical about it, it was after the 13th Amendment, which was a few months after the war ended. Is this some kind of trick question where you're going to claim something abstract like shift work is actually a continuation of slavery? No. Traditional chattel slavery. Juneteenth, final answer. Still wrong. Is this going to be another hour-long Knowing Better video about how something we thought ended a century ago actually didn't? This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream and Nebula. You're telling me they invented a picture frame that can show whatever image you want on it? Will you get back in the closet, man? This isn't really a topic for lighthearted characters. You're talking about the Civil War, and you don't need your Civil War character. We're actually going to be talking about a whole lot more than just the Civil War. But that's irrelevant. Nobody cares about you. Most people don't even know your name. And besides, if I use you, people are just going to say that Atun Shea did it better. Checkmate, Lincolnats. You're right. Okay, well, like the majority of my audience, I'm an American. Always have been. I went through elementary, middle, and high school, then I went on to college to become a social studies teacher, and then I taught US history in 2 different states at the middle and high school level. Am I giving you my credentials in order to brag? No, quite the opposite actually. I was taught what I'm going to be calling the standard American history myth. Throughout all of my years of education, including college twice, the story had barely changed between the 1990s and 2010s. And then I taught that same myth to the next generation of students. Since I'm going to be spending the rest of this video dismantling this story, and at least some of my audience isn't American, it's probably a good idea to make sure we're all on the same page. As you can see, I have a brand new TV, so I can show you video clips whenever I want. Now, I found this video from an online university that sums up what most of us have been taught and therefore believe about American history. Let me just, US history in 4 minutes or less. America was founded when a group of Protestant Christians, fleeing religious persecution in Europe, made the harrowing journey across the Atlantic Ocean and landed at Plymouth Rock. These pilgrims had a feast with the Indians to celebrate their cooperation, and that became the holiday of Thanksgiving. Over the next few decades, several other British colonies were founded on the American continent, and in 1776, they all declared their independence from the king over the issue of taxation without representation. After the Revolutionary War had been won, the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, a freedom-loving liberty document which guaranteed that all men were created equal. There's one glaring hypocrisy with that statement, though, the fact that slavery existed in America. How could the Founding Fathers believe in equality while many of them were also slave owners? Well, many of them knew that this peculiar institution was morally wrong and thought that the practice would naturally die out on its own. But just to be sure, they put a clause in the Constitution saying that the importation of new slaves would end in 1808. None of the Founding Fathers could have predicted the cotton gin, though, which suddenly made slavery much more profitable, and all but guaranteed it would continue for another century. Throughout the 1800s, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass fought to end the practice, and in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected on that very platform. In order to protect their rights as states and keep their taxes from increasing, several southern states decided to break away from the Union and form their own country known as the Confederacy. From 1861 to 1865, America fought the bloodiest war in its history, and in the end, the Union was preserved and 4 million black people were freed from bondage. It's a common misconception that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, but the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to areas in active rebellion, meaning the Confederate states. There was no way to enforce that without invading, and the northern slave states were unaffected, so this didn't really do much. In reality, it wasn't the Great Emancipator, but the 13th Amendment, ratified 8 months after his assassination, that abolished slavery. Reconstruction lasted from 1865 to 1877 and was marked by a period of relative peace since federal troops were stationed in the South to guarantee the rights of the recently freed slaves. After Reconstruction ended, though, things got pretty dark pretty fast. Within a decade, black codes had been passed in every southern state, and many of them required literacy tests and poll taxes to vote. This is the beginning of Jim Crow, an era where black people had to sit at the back of the bus and drink out of separate water fountains. They even had separate schools for white kids and black kids. That lasted until 1954, when the Supreme Court decided to desegregate public schools with the Brown v. Board of Education decision. This began the civil rights movement, which gave rise to leaders like Martin Luther King, who said we should judge each other not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Jim Crow and segregation were over, and America had finally swept away the last vestiges of racism in the country. We even elected a black man as president. Twice. So the next time someone tells you that America is a racist country with racism in our DNA, hopefully now you'll know better. I'm No Less Better, author of You Learned Everything You Need to Know About History in Elementary School for Better University. Thank you for watching. To help keep Knowing Better videos free, subscribe to our Patreon page at Patreon. I don't apologize for that, nor do you actually want an apology. That was hilarious. You're probably familiar with most of what was said in that video. You might have picked out a small inaccuracy here or there, but for the most part, that was the story you learned as a kid, and the one you likely still believe. I know that because that was the story I was taught, and the story I then taught to others almost 2 decades later. It's also the story fake YouTube universities continue to push to this day. Yes, that was a PragerU parody. Just about every sentence was paraphrased from one of their videos. And they're usually pushing the message that your kids are learning something different and scary.
I was spared the life-sapping, negative messages about America that are crippling a generation of young people. These ideas are poison.
As a social studies teacher, I can assure you that no K-12 student is being taught that America is a racist country or was founded on racist ideals. And they're certainly not learning critical race theory, because if you stray from that standard story, you'll have an angry parent on the phone by the afternoon, and you'll be talking to your superintendent by the end of the week. Before you assume anything, that did not happen to me. I 100% believed that version of American history the entire time I worked in a classroom. And honestly, for years afterward. But that general story, the standard myth that America was founded on freedom, slavery ended after the Civil War, and segregation lasted until Martin Luther King, doesn't really explain the current state of racial inequality and leaves a lot more questions than answers. I mean, if black people have been free for 150 years, why is there still so much inequality? Why haven't they caught up yet? You can come at this from multiple different angles. Why do they perform worse in school? Why do they make less money? Why are they convicted of more crime? Why aren't they elected to office at a rate more proportional to— The point is, you're never given an answer to these questions. You're left to make it up on your own. If America is the land of equality and some people just can't seem to do well, there must be something inherently different about that group of people specifically that prevents them from succeeding. Most Americans are never taught that maybe the system itself is rigged against them. But even more than that, they never learned that the fundamental premise of that question, that slavery ended 150 years ago, is incorrect. I'm not talking about the prison industrial complex or unpaid internships. I'm talking about ball and chain chattel slavery. If the standard American history myth that we all grew up hearing is wrong, when was the last slave freed in America? Okay, we don't need a second title card. I don't know why it did that. Before we can get to your first guess, the Civil War, it's important to talk about the political and societal situation leading into it and correct several misconceptions. Firstly, America was not founded by the Pilgrims, nor were they fleeing any kind of religious persecution, but clearing up that specific myth is a story for another time. Jamestown, Virginia was the first permanent British colony in America, founded in 1607. If you watched my Company Towns video, you're familiar with this place. It was a tobacco plantation that began to use slave labor after a workers' strike in 1619. This is why the 1619 Project marks this as the beginning of America, because it kind of is. The Mayflower didn't happen until 1620. The Pilgrims had no intention of founding a new country, and the Thanksgiving part didn't get added to the story until way later. But again, another time. For decades, the various colonies in America existed as somewhat mixed communities. There were free white people, a few free black people, white indentured servants, black indentured servants, and slaves who were either black or Native American. That lasted until Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when most of these groups rebelled against the ruling class because they wanted to expand further west. This was 100 years before independence. The colonies were ruled by the same aristocracy that existed in Britain, and in response to the uprising, they decided that the best way to keep the rabble in line was to divide and conquer. In the years that followed, Virginia passed a number of slave codes that stripped all black people of any rights. By 1705, there were basically no free or indentured black people in Virginia. They were no longer considered citizens. They couldn't own property, guns, or employ a white person. This will be a recurring theme going forward. The laws in America were used to force black people into an underclass. Over the next 2 centuries, the rich white landowners of the South, including many of the founding fathers, relied on slave labor to keep their economy going. And at this point, slavery was still legal in every northern colony as well. In 1769, Charles Stuart traveled with his slave, James Somerset, from Massachusetts to England. They lived there for a few years until Somerset tried to escape and was imprisoned. In 1772, his case was heard by Lord Mansfield, the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, who determined,
"The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only by positive law. It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. Whatever inconveniences therefore may follow from the decision, I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged."
Basically, what he just said is that slavery is an unnatural condition and can only exist if there is a law specifically stating it can exist. That's what he means by positive law. There was no such law in England, therefore slavery cannot exist there. It's unclear who came up with this famous line, but it was said that the air in England was so pure that if an enslaved person were to breathe it in, they would instantly become free. This decision popularized the abolition and anti-slavery movements, which had quietly existed for some time. You know the next part. There's some spilled tea, a few lanterns in a window, Mel Gibson, and eventually recognition of our independence. A few years after that, the Founding Fathers got together to write the Constitution. There were 55 delegates, so there were disagreements on nearly every issue. Among the noteworthy, there were abolitionists like John Adams and slave owners like Thomas Jefferson. As a result, the issue of slavery appears in the Constitution 3 times without ever actually using the word slavery. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 states,
"Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this Union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons."
This is the 3/5 compromise, which we all learn about in school. 2 things to note here. First, it doesn't say that black people are only worth 3/5 of a person. It just says that 3/5 of the total number shall be counted, which is basically the same thing but worded slightly differently. Secondly, indentured servants still count towards the population. It was just Indians and other persons who are not.
It wasn't the racists of the South who wanted to count slave populations less than white populations. It was the abolitionists of the North.
Not sure why it keeps cutting to stuff. These old CRTs are kind of buggy. Anyway, she is right about that, but why? The 3/5 compromise was a way for the southern states to increase their representation in Congress and the Electoral College. If they had their way, they would have counted all of the people that they themselves did not consider to be citizens. That way they could artificially inflate their national political power. The North would have preferred to count none of them, because if they're not voting and they don't have any rights, who exactly are you representing? The second clause of the Constitution dealing with slavery is Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1.
"The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed upon such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person."
I have misunderstood and taught this clause of the Constitution incorrectly for years.
Children, our founding fathers knew that slavery was evil and wrong. and they knew that it would do terrible harm to the nation. Our founders created a system they thought would have slavery end gradually.
Oh God, was that like a kid's video? No, we're not doing this. No more TV. Okay, well, the Founding Fathers did not know that slavery was evil and wrong. Some of them actively participated in it and fought for the various compromises we're learning about right now. They did not create a system that would have it end gradually. This clause of the Constitution does not ban the importation of new slaves. Go back and read it. It basically says, Congress shall make no law abridging the slave trade until 1808, which is exactly what happened. They banned it that year. But the point is, the institution and expansion of slavery was protected by the Constitution for the first 20 years of its existence. The Founding Fathers did not plan for it to end. That's just how it happened to work out. The final mention of I'm actually going to need the TV if we're going to keep doing this. We'll just deal with the random clips, I guess. The final mention of slavery can be found in Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3.
No person held in service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due.
This is the Fugitive Slave Clause, which states that if an enslaved person escapes to a free state, the slave owner can still hunt them down and return them to bondage. Unlike in Britain, in America, breathing free air does not automatically make one free. I just want to point out that the Constitution went out of its way to include a direct response to the Somerset case, stating that those circumstances could never happen here. It's also important to remember that America didn't exist in a vacuum. Things were happening in other countries too. One such country was Haiti, a French colony in the Caribbean which used slave labor to grow its sugar industry until the slaves decided they had enough. They fought for 12 years and gained their independence in 1804. After this successful slave revolt, two things happened. One, America seemed to decide that no matter what, Haiti would be perpetually impoverished. And two, Black people couldn't read anymore. If they found out about Haiti, they might try that here, which is exactly what Nat Turner did in Virginia in 1831, so no more reading. While some states, like South Carolina, banned Black literacy during the colonial era, most southern states didn't enact similar laws until the 1820s and 30s, when the abolition movement was really gaining steam. As a result, we have very few first-hand accounts of slavery written by the actual slaves themselves. Most of their stories are lost to history. Britain abolished slavery in its overseas territories in 1833, and while it's fun to play alternate history and wonder if that would have included America had the revolution failed, there's no way to know for sure. But this did include Canada, which meant that the Underground Railroad finally had a real destination. When Frederick Douglass escaped to New York City in 1838, he was still subject to the Fugitive Slave Clause and could be legally recaptured at any moment. Rather than continue on to Canada, he decided to become one of the country's most prominent abolitionists.
So, you're trying to work for change inside of the American system.
Precisely, Layla. Our system is wonderful, and the Constitution is a glorious liberty document.
Oh no, I forgot we were on the kids one. This is PragerU portraying Frederick Douglass as one of the good ones for working within the system to get slavery abolished, which immediately falls apart when you remember that we had to fight a war. I can't take any more of the kids one. Let me change the channel.
The movement's leader, William Lloyd Garrison, burned the Constitution at his July 4th speeches. In Garrison's view, it legally protected slavery and was therefore irredeemable. But Douglass came to reject that. He believed that the Constitution was fundamentally opposed to slavery. Interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, Douglass said, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document.
There's that line again, glorious liberty document. Personally, I find William Lloyd Garrison's argument to be a bit more compelling, especially considering those three clauses we just went over that exclusively protected slavery. But that line actually comes from a speech Douglass gave in 1852 titled, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?"
What to the American slave is your 4th July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty, an unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impotence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impunity, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour.
Well, that's rather scathing, but not the line I was looking for.
In that instrument, I hold there is neither warrant, license, nor sanction of the hateful thing, but interpreted as it ought to be interpreted. The Constitution is a glorious liberty document. Read its preamble. Consider its purpose. Is slavery among them? Let me ask, if the Constitution were intended to be, by its framers and adopters, a slave-holding instrument, why neither slavery, slave-holding, nor slave can anywhere be found in it?
I mean, just because it doesn't use the word slave doesn't mean he's basically making the Somerset argument. Since the Constitution doesn't include a positive law allowing for the institution of slavery, it shouldn't exist. But it did, so look, I'm just a former high school teacher turned YouTuber. What do I know? What did the Supreme Court have to say on the matter? They're the ones who are supposed to interpret the Constitution and figure out the framers' original intent. Throughout the 1840s and 50s, Dred Scott sued his owner for his freedom multiple times. He stated that since he had been brought to the free state of Wisconsin, he was now legally free. Again, referencing the Somerset case. The lower courts went back and forth on the matter until it reached the Supreme Court in 1857. I want you to stop for a moment and remember back to what you were taught about this case. How was the decision framed to you? Did they decide that he was free or that he was a slave? Here's the actual opinion from Chief Justice Taney.
In the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times, and the language used in the Declaration of Independence, show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. And upon a full and careful consideration of the subject, the court is of the opinion that, upon the facts stated in the plea in abatement, Dred Scott was not a citizen of Missouri within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States, and not entitled, as such, to sue in its courts.
So again, was Dred Scott a free man or a slave? The answer was neither. He's not a citizen, so who cares? Black people had no rights to which the white man was bound to respect. The Declaration of Independence was not referring to them. They were not created equal. They are not, have never been, and will never be citizens of the United States. This was the highest court in the land saying that the country's foundational documents never meant to include black people, and it's phrased as if this is just common sense at the time. In effect, this was the government telling Douglas he was wrong. The Constitution is not a glorious liberty document, at least not for people like him. Just a few years earlier, they passed the Fugitive Slave Act. So not only could slave catchers come get you if you were in the North, but Northerners had to turn you in if they knew you were a runaway. This forced people in the North, including abolitionists, to participate in the slave trade under pain of prosecution. Around this time, we began to see a shift in the way slaves were used. While the majority of them were still in agriculture, usually cotton, sugar, or tobacco, other industries began experimenting with slave labor. In 1850, the Bibb Steam Mill Company, a sawmill in Alabama, owned 27 slaves and leased others from surrounding farms. This is important because this is the beginning of industrial slavery, when corporations owned people rather than just some rich guy on a plantation. Railroads soon got into the mix, and by the beginning of the Civil War, they collectively owned about 20,000 slaves. So, alright, the Civil War, which began after Lincoln's election because the southern states were worried that he was going to possibly end slavery, or at the very least, stop it from expanding west. It's a real bummer that I have to take time out to explain this, but it's important.
Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth.
That was the Vice President of the Confederacy saying that this is the first government to be founded on the idea that black people are subservient to white people. I mean, arguably not, right? Like the United States was. Anyway, the point is, whether they were first or not, the Confederacy was founded specifically to defend the institution of slavery, and every state that seceded made sure to mention that as they left. At first, Abraham Lincoln had no real intention of freeing the slaves. This war was about preserving the Union.
My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that.
Now, don't get it twisted. Abraham Lincoln was definitely against slavery, but keeping the United States united was more important to him when he wrote that. But for the Confederacy, this war was entirely about slavery from start to finish. The evidence is so clear and overwhelming that it's almost impossible to argue otherwise. Here, I'll prove it to you.
The evidence is clear and overwhelming. Slavery was, by a wide margin, the single most important cause of the Civil War.
Did you think you'd ever actually agree with PragerU? When the various southern states seceded, any factories that were owned by Northerners were confiscated and transferred into Southern hands, and those new owners quickly staffed those mills and furnaces with slave labor. Since all the white men were off fighting, the Civil War caused a dramatic increase in the use of industrial slavery. As soon as the war began, 40 slaves were put into the Sewanee mines, and the Empire State Iron and Coal Company put an ad in the local newspaper looking to hire or buy 100 able-bodied hands. Within a few years, the Shelby Iron Works owned between 350 and 400 slaves. And to cap it all off, in 1863, the Confederate government bought the Briarfield Iron Works in Alabama, which included 9 black men listed on the inventory under livestock. Just to reiterate that, that's the Confederate government itself owning slaves. Within a few months of the outbreak of the war, the North passed the Confiscation Act of 1861, stating that any escaped slaves who made it to the North were to be considered captured enemy property or contraband of war. While still not viewing them as people, this was at least the end of the Fugitive Slave Act. As the war began to turn in the North's favor, Lincoln entertained the idea of abolishing slavery, but didn't think that the United States could continue to exist as a mixed-race society. So he proposed recolonizing the former slaves to Central America, to a place called Lincolnia. If that sounds familiar, it's because this is the exact same thing President Monroe tried to do with Liberia. This was just a new take on an old idea. This is where Frederick Douglass has the most impact. He convinced Lincoln out of the recolonization plan and into the Emancipation Proclamation, which, as stated earlier, wasn't really enforceable and didn't really do much in terms of freeing anyone. But it did allow the Union Army to enlist black people. Douglass thought that if the United States saw black men fighting for their own freedom, there was no way they could deny their citizenship going forward. 2 of his sons ended up enlisting in the 54th Massachusetts. Upon hearing about the Emancipation Proclamation, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, issued his own counter-proclamation, saying that any black soldiers they capture will be returned to a state of slavery or, in practice, executed. The Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863, and by the time Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address 11 months later, the entire purpose of the war had shifted. So many people had died that Lincoln began to wonder if preserving the Union was really worth the human cost. But if he could reframe this war as the fight to free 4 million black people who were being held in chains, suddenly the death toll doesn't matter as much. The North was already starting to win at this point, but Now they had a renewed sense of purpose. Imagine going from putting down a rebellion in a part of the country you don't really care about to ending slavery. In terms of righteous causes, that's even better than fighting for your own freedom. In January 1865, when the 13th Amendment was still being discussed in Congress, General Sherman issued Special Field Order 15. This divided up 400,000 acres of abandoned lands along the Georgia coast to be given to the freedmen, which is what we were calling former slaves. According to the order, each family was to get 40 acres and a mule, and by June of that year, over 40,000 parcels of land had been redistributed. This is reparations. We actually did reparations. But don't get excited. In March 1865, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was established, more commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau. Their primary job was to protect the rights of recently freed slaves and help them get their 40 acres. The Civil War ended on April 9th, and when Abraham Lincoln suggested that black soldiers who fought for the Union should get the vote, John Wilkes Booth decided to kill him. As a result, on April 14th, 1865, Andrew Johnson became president. He was a Southern Democrat who remained loyal to the Union during the war, and Lincoln chose him as VP as a sign of his willingness to reconcile. Johnson also happened to be a raging white supremacist.
This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men.
Fuck. Within 6 months of his inauguration, he ordered the Freedmen's Bureau to return all of the 40-acre plots that had been distributed back to white ownership. Put another way, he confiscated the land and undid reparations. This was the beginning of presidential Reconstruction, which was supposed to be a rapid, lenient restoration of the Union with as few changes to the Constitution as possible. Once the 13th Amendment was ratified, he thought that should be the end of it. Just to recap the timeline here, the war ended in April 1865, the last remnants of the Confederacy surrendered on June 19th, and the 13th Amendment was ratified in December of that year. What do you think happened after that? The freedmen just walked off into the sunset, end of movie, roll credits? Obviously not, right? The South still needed to harvest crops, and they weren't about to let 4 million laborers just go free and do whatever. Many of the freedmen ended up working on the same plantations that used to own them as slaves. The planter class had them sign labor contracts, which often included slave-like conditions. They agreed to be locked in a cell or chained up at night, not leave the property, obey commands, speak in a servile manner, and accept whatever punishment was deemed necessary. Why would anyone sign these? Because black literacy had been illegal for decades. Most of them couldn't read. By the end of the next year, most of these contracts were dissolved by the occupying Union commanders because it was obvious that the South was just trying to bring back slavery. It was clear to Congress, at least, that much more needed to be done. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared all persons born in the United States to be full-fledged citizens, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. Johnson vetoed the bill, and for the first time ever, Congress voted to override that and push it through anyway. If the wording of that act sounds familiar, that's because it was eventually replaced by the 14th Amendment, which didn't get ratified until 1868. Andrew Johnson denounced the amendment as usurping state authority. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 ended Johnson's plan and began radical Reconstruction, when the former Confederate states were divided up into 5 military districts, each commanded by a general who enforced the law. It also required the new Southern governments to ratify the 14th Amendment. As you probably guessed, Andrew Johnson also vetoed this bill, and again, it was overridden by Congress, and as a result, 38,000 federal troops were stationed in the South, half of whom were black. And as a further result of this law, the Ku Klux Klan consolidated power and became much more active. The KKK was formed on Christmas Eve 1865, but can trace its origins back to when the Confederate government established militias known as Home Guards to patrol the countryside looking for deserters and runaway slaves. When the war ended, these Home Guards began a guerrilla campaign against Union troops and eventually turned to terrorism. Entire families of freedmen were lynched. The only way the former slaves were going to be guaranteed their safety and freedom was with the presence of tens of thousands of federal troops. During the election of 1868, they stood guard outside of every polling place in the South. With the end of the 3/5 compromise, Southern representation in Congress was about to dramatically increase, so They were required to allow black men to vote, even though black people still couldn't vote in most states in the North because the 15th Amendment wouldn't be ratified until 1870.
Federal troops stationed in the South helped secure rights for the newly freed slaves. Hundreds of black men were elected to Southern state legislatures as Republicans, and 22 black Republicans served in the U.S. Congress by 1900.
I want you to remember that she stopped counting in 1900. Once you have that locked away, she is right. In 1870, 1,500 black politicians began serving in state and federal office. Almost all of them were Republicans because it was the party of Lincoln, obviously. Hiram Revels was the first black U.S. senator, a Republican from Mississippi, believe it or not. That same year, the federal government declared the KKK to be a terrorist organization, and after a riot in South Carolina, President Ulysses S. Grant declared martial law and suspended habeas corpus for any suspected members. This completely destroyed the Ku Klux Klan by 1872. You won't believe what brought them back, but we'll get to that. The presidential election of 1876 split the popular and electoral vote, a situation we're all too familiar with these days. As a result, we ended up with the Compromise of 1877. Southern Democrats, who now held a majority in Congress, would accept Republican Rutherford B. Hayes as president in return for the removal of federal troops from the South. Have you noticed that all of our compromises just end up being concessions to the South? This was the definitive end of Reconstruction. Without federal troops or the Freedmen's Bureau around, white supremacist violence and intimidation was allowed to run wild. But more importantly, Southern governments were free to do whatever they wanted. Immediately after the Civil War and throughout Reconstruction, every Southern state enacted what would later become known as Black Codes. We all learn about these in school, right? But can you actually describe a black code? My guess is you probably have this confused with an early form of segregation. They weren't allowed in certain public spaces, interracial marriage was outlawed, that kind of stuff. Or maybe you think this restricted voting or property rights.
With measures like black codes, laws that restricted the ability of blacks to own property and run businesses, and they imposed poll taxes and literacy tests used to subvert black citizens' right to vote.
Most of that stuff doesn't come along until way later, so what is a black code? These were a set of laws written in a colorblind fashion, making it a crime for everyone, but in practice, they were only ever illegal for black people, which is probably why we don't really learn about these in school. This is somewhat uncomfortable to talk about because we think of the law as neutral. If it says murder is illegal, it's illegal for everyone. But we're not talking about violence or theft here. The black codes were basically made-up social crimes, most of which were victimless. The most important and egregious one was vagrancy, which is the act of being unemployed, usually defined as when a laborer or servant loiters away his time. Do you see why so many of the recently freed slaves signed labor contracts with their former owners? Many states imposed fines on or made it illegal for black people to work in any industry other than agriculture or domestic service. So congratulations, you're free to do whatever you want, as long as it's the thing you were already doing as a slave. It was also against the law to quit your job or break a labor contract, which was prosecuted as fraud or false pretenses, as they called it in many states. As a white person, you couldn't hire a freedman without proper discharge paperwork from their previous employer. This meant that as a black person in the South, you had to have a white person who could speak for you as your employer, or at the very least, former employer. If you didn't have that protection, you ran the risk of being arrested for vagrancy. Since the road system in the South wasn't very robust, if you wanted to get from one place to another, the easiest way was to hop on a freight train, which was illegal without a ticket. The second easiest way was to walk alongside the track, which was trespassing. Gambling, drinking, and even carrying a concealed weapon were crimes for black people only. That can include anything from a gun to a knife to a razor. Using obscene or offensive language or talking too loudly in the presence of a white woman was illegal. Remember this?
I'm gonna tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
This has been going on for over 150 years. White women have always held a special power over black men. Interracial sexual relations were illegal, but only if it was a black man with a white woman, and even then, only the black man was punished. They prosecuted that under miscegenation or adultery, depending on the circumstances. Many states also passed what were called pig laws, elevating what would have been a petty crime to the level of a felony. Stealing a pig worth $1 would get you 5 years in prison. The theft of an 8-cent fence post was enough to get you sentenced to hard labor. And now we're getting to the point, because as soon as these laws were in place, the South began to use the black codes to transition away from slavery and towards convict labor. You probably think I'm talking about chain gangs, but those don't happen until much later. Before the Civil War, the judicial system was exclusively designed for white people. If a black person committed a crime, I'm sorry to say, but it was viewed the same way as your dog committing a crime. They were chattel property, so punishment was left to the owner. Even after the war, prisons were few and far between. Only the worst crimes were punished with jail time. Most of the black codes just involved a fine or hard labor. So these laws weren't designed to put black people behind bars. They were designed to put them to work. The first system I want to talk about is convict leasing. It's one of those things that we all learn about eventually, usually by watching The Shawshank Redemption, which, while being a good example, is also an extremely sanitized one. To truly understand how this scheme played out, we have to let go of all of our modern ideas of how the criminal justice system is supposed to work. At this point in history, police departments barely existed, and even then, only in major cities. Do you know what a notary public is? They're someone entrusted by the government to witness signatures on contracts. You can find them in banks, post offices, grocery stores. Hell, some of you watching this might even be a notary public. Well, back in the day, justices of the peace functioned in the same way. They were innkeepers, tailors, and even plantation owners who adjudicated crime at the county level, which was most crime at this point. It was rare for the state or federal government to get involved. County law enforcement was handled by an elected sheriff, but this was usually just an administrative role. The actual work was done by appointed deputies who could be storekeepers, grocers, and again, plantation owners. Can you figure out what's about to happen here? A sheriff's deputy, a bounty hunter, or sometimes just a random white person would seize a black man walking along a railroad track and take him to the nearest justice of the peace / tavern owner. The justice would invariably find them guilty of something. They would impose a fine or sentence them to hard labor, which basically allowed the government to sell the convict to the highest bidder. In 1866, both Alabama and Texas leased hundreds of their prisoners to railroad companies. Within a few years, Mississippi convicts were back working on cotton plantations, and Tennessee had sent theirs across the border into the mines of Birmingham. By the time Reconstruction ended, every southern state and county had a convict leasing program. They didn't really generate much revenue for the government, but they were seen as a benefit because it saved them from having to pay for housing and food for the prisoners. The main purpose of convict leasing was to keep the southern economy moving with a nearly free labor force. Birmingham, Alabama was founded in 1871 as a steel manufacturing hub for the South, but its origins trace back to when the Confederacy financed the first blast furnaces and put slaves in the various coal mines. This is a natural continuation of the industrial slavery we were talking about earlier. After the war ended, companies like Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Rail switched from leasing slaves from nearby farms to leasing convicts from the government. On March 30th, 1908, Green Cottonham was arrested for riding a freight train without a ticket. When no evidence or witnesses could be produced to support that charge, the judge declared him guilty of vagrancy. He was sentenced to 3 months of hard labor, extended to 6 months and 6 days to cover the court fees. Shelby County, Alabama then leased him to the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Rail Company, which put him to work on slope number 12 of the Pratt Mines near Birmingham. They paid the county $12 a month for his labor. He died of disease 5 months into his sentence. Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Rail entered into its first convict leasing contract with the state of Alabama in 1888, paying anywhere from $9 to $18 a month, depending on the prisoner. By 1900, there would be over 1,000 convicts working the mines, less than 70 of which were white. It's easy not to care about these people because they're criminals, right? If you don't want to do hard labor, maybe don't commit crimes. But it's worth asking what these people did that got them there. In 1890, Alabama conducted a survey of all the convicts they sent into the Pratt mines. Among the felonies, there were 11 for false pretense, which is quitting your job or breaking a labor contract, 7 for bigamy, 6 for miscegenation, which is interracial sexual relations, 4 for homosexuality, and 2 for illegal voting. Among the misdemeanors, there were 94 for petty theft, 46 for carrying a concealed weapon, 24 for false pretense, 24 for obscene language, 19 for gambling, 13 for selling whiskey, 8 not given, don't worry, we'll come back to that, 7 for vagrancy, 5 for violating a contract with a white employer, 3 for bastardry, and 2 for selling cotton after sunset. Selling cotton after sunset? I thought this was America. How could the time of day affect the legality of the free exchange of goods and services? It didn't. After sunset was code. Whenever you see that, just substitute it with the phrase, for black people. This is how sundown towns worked, because they obviously couldn't pass a law explicitly stating that black people weren't welcome. They had to make it a crime to just do something after sunset. These sunset laws are still on the books in many places. You'll often find them on lists of the weirdest laws from every state. It really changes your perspective when you find out what these crimes actually were. Carrying a razor in your pocket, walking along a railroad, or quitting your job. I've literally done all of those things, and I would never expect to go to prison for them. You probably noticed while going over that list that there weren't any violent crimes. People were being sentenced to hard labor for swearing or gambling. John Clark was convicted of gaming on April 11th, 1903. The usual punishment would have been 10 days of hard labor, but because of court fees, that was extended to 114 days. And he was leased to the Kohlberg mine. He died after 34 days when he was crushed by falling rock. I don't know about you, but I don't think the punishment for rolling dice on the sidewalk should be hard manual labor until death. The Kohlberg mine alone had an annual convict death rate of 30%. But as bad as that sounds, convict leasing was not limited to coal mines. Counties often rented out their prisoners to any farmer or plantation owner who could afford them, which, thanks to this new system, was basically everyone. Slaves used to cost hundreds, even thousands of dollars. They were so expensive that only the richest plantation owners could participate in the trade. But leasing a convict only costs a few bucks a month. Even poor farmers can afford that. And unlike the old days, there was no incentive to keep your black laborer at least somewhat healthy. You could literally just work them to death and then get a new one tomorrow. This isn't just my enlightened historical perspective. The Department of Justice held the same opinion over 100 years ago.
This system is more cruel and inhuman than the slavery of antebellum days. Since then, the master conserved the life and health of the slave for business reasons, just as he did that of his horse or mule. But now the master treated the slave unmercifully, and with the sole object of getting the greatest possible amount of labor out of him. Moreover, a convict costs but a few dollars, while a slave used to cost several hundred.
Here's where I need to introduce another important concept known as debt peonage, which is when a person compels a laborer to work or holds them in servitude to pay off a debt. I know that a lot of you are immediately going to think I'm talking about sharecropping, and I'm not. Just briefly, sharecropping was when a landlord would let a tenant farmer work a piece of their property in exchange for a share of the final crop. While sharecroppers often fell into debt, especially after a bad season, they were still technically free, and mostly white. Debt peonage is when you owe me $10 and you're basically my slave until you pay it off. This is the same basic idea behind convict leasing. You owe money to the state or county, so you work it off with hard labor. But let's say you owe a fine and you can't pay it. You don't want to be sent to the mines, but you're in luck. The sheriff's deputy who arrested you is also a plantation owner. He's willing to pay your fine for you as long as you're willing to work off the debt on his farm. You sign a labor contract for 9 months. Not realizing you also just agreed to be locked up at night and pay for your own recapture should you try to escape. Keep in mind that since your debt to the state has been settled, you're technically not a criminal anymore. You're just a laborer who has agreed to be treated like one. Meanwhile, all the food, clothing, housing, and medicine you're being provided with is adding to your debt and increasing your time. At this rate, it's going to take years to pay off that fine. So, alright, let's say you'd rather avoid all that and fight the charge. You didn't do anything wrong, they can't prove anything. Good luck with that. You have no right to an attorney. That doesn't start until 1964. You're a black man and you stand accused by a white sheriff's deputy, and the white justice of the peace has unilateral authority to declare you guilty. It is a foregone conclusion that you will be convicted of something. Even more than that, the longer the trial goes on and the more witnesses that are called, the higher the fine will be when you lose. And you will lose, which is why by the 1880s, the obscure legal practice of confessing judgment had become popular. This is when you plead guilty to a lesser charge and accept a lesser punishment, because fighting it and going to trial would make things much worse for you. Nowadays, we call this plea bargaining, but This is where it started. Remember those 8 people who were convicted of not given and sent into the Pratt mines? This is what happened to them. They just pled guilty. The court didn't even bother to write down for what crime because it didn't matter. In 1898, the largest criminal category for convict laborers in Alabama was not given. In September 1901, John Davis was arrested for vagrancy. When that charge could not be proven, he was judged guilty of obtaining goods under false pretense and ordered to pay a fine of $75. A man named John W. Pace paid his fine for him, and they signed a 10-month labor contract. After 12 months on Pace's plantation, Davis was sold to another farmer for $50. It's unclear how long he was held there. John Davis was arrested by a man named Robert Franklin and judged by a justice of the peace named James Kennedy, both of whom were employed by John W. Pace. In May 1903, the Department of Justice announced an investigation into Pace's slavery ring, and John Davis would eventually testify at the trial. Here's how the federal prosecutor in the case, Warren Reese, described the scheme in his own words.
There have been flagrant abuses and violations on the part of wealthy and influential men. These violations have not been confined to 1 or 2 periodical and independent instances, but it has developed into a miserable business and custom to catch up ignorant and helpless Negro men and women upon the flimsiest and most baseless charges and carry them before a justice of the peace, who is usually a paid hireling of these wealthy dealers. The victim is found guilty and a fine is assessed, which, in the beginning, cannot be paid by the victim. And then it is that one of these slave dealers steps up, pretends to be the friend of the Negro, telling him he will pay him out if he will sign a contract to work for him on his farm. The Negro readily agrees rather than go to the mines, as he is informed he will have to do. His fine is paid, the contract is signed, and the Negro is taken to the farm or mine or mill or quarry of the employer. Placed into a condition of involuntary servitude, he is locked up at night in the cell, worked under guards during the day from 3 o'clock in the morning till 7 or 8 o'clock at night, whipped in a most cruel manner, is insufficiently fed or poorly clad. In fact, the evidence in nearly all the cases investigated reveals that the Negro men are worked nearly naked, while the women are worked in an equally disgraceful manner. Brutal things have transpired, and sometimes death has resulted from the infliction of corporal punishment. If they run away, the dogs are placed upon their track, and they are invariably retaken and subjected to more cruel treatment. When the time of a good-working Negro is nearing an end, he is rearrested upon some trumped-up charge and again carried before some bribed justice and resentenced to an additional time. In this way, Negroes have been known to have worked in these places and in this situation for years and years. They can get no word to friends, nor is word allowed to reach them from the outside world. They are held in abject slavery, without any knowledge of what goes on in the outside world. The indictments so far found are based upon some 25 Negro men and women who have been the subjects of these violations. These are some of the most severe instances, but it has been discovered that there are hundreds of other cases.
I know what you're thinking. Oh, well, it was only a few hundred people. That doesn't sound that bad. Nope. In the years after the Civil War, over 800,000 people were caught up in this system. This was one indictment in one county in one state, and there were hundreds of victims. During this same period, there were similar cases being heard in Georgia, Florida, Texas, basically everywhere. To put that in perspective, we freed 4 million black people and then re-enslaved a fifth of them as convicts and debt peons. And before you go thinking that these cases had a happy ending, remember the primary question of this video. When was the last slave freed in America? If you hadn't noticed, you still don't have an answer to that question. John W. Pace and his co-conspirators were charged with violating the federal anti-peonage statute, which was passed in 1867 to abolish the serf-like conditions that existed in the New Mexico territory. When we acquired all of that land from Mexico, we also acquired the societal structure of the people living there. So we got rid of the peonage system and then gave away free land to anyone willing to move there during the various Homestead Acts, which were kind of like reparations, but only for white people. And they weren't really making up for anything, it was just kind of a bonus. Anyway, Pace and his friends' actual defense was that since the debts that were owed to them were fictitious, this wasn't peonage, it was slavery, and slavery wasn't illegal. And they were right. Their charges were dismissed or they got off on appeal. Most of the other cases around the country fell apart for the same reason, because believe it or not, slavery was not a crime. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime blah blah, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. You know what it doesn't say? Anyone caught engaging in slavery is guilty of a felony and shall serve blah blah in prison blah blah. It abolished slavery as a legal concept, but didn't provide any punishment for continuing the practice anyway. It does include a section that says Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, but Congress never got around to doing that. John W. Pace renewed his leasing contract with the county and was found to be holding slaves on his property less than a year later. And there was nothing anybody could do about it. As a result, this neo-slavery, disguised as debt peonage, was allowed to continue for decades. If you're not seething with anger right now, you need to look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself why that is. As I mentioned, this wasn't isolated to the coal mines and cotton plantations of Alabama. Convict debt peons were cutting sugarcane in Texas, harvesting turpentine in Florida, and working at the infamous Chattahoochee Brick Company in Georgia, where they liked to use child convicts because they were small enough to fit inside of the kilns. After public hearings on corruption and conditions within their leasing system, the state of Georgia decided to abolish their program in 1909. Martin Tabert was arrested for vagrancy in the winter of 1921. He was found guilty and was imposed a fine of $25. His family actually sent the money, but by the time it arrived, he had already been leased to a turpentine camp in Florida on a 3-month contract. Shortly afterwards, he was whipped over 100 times by an overseer and died of his wounds. Normally, this wouldn't change anything. This happened literally every day all over the South, but Martin Tabert was a rich white kid from North Dakota. He was a 22-year-old on a cross-country backpacking trip when he was arrested. His family pressed charges, and the resulting media frenzy caused such a nationwide outrage that Florida ended its convict leasing system in 1923. Alabama didn't end their program until 1928. Making them the last state to do so. In that final year, the state had over 37,000 prisoners leased out to various companies and plantations, 12,500 of which were sentenced to hard labor for the sale or possession of alcohol, because at this point, prohibition was a thing. 2,735 were in for vagrancy, 2,014 for gaming, 458 for leaving a farm without permission, and 154 for adultery and miscegenation. Once a state ended its convict leasing program, they transitioned to using prison labor on state projects like roads and highways. These are the chain gangs you're familiar with. They start in the 1920s and 30s. Meanwhile, county convict leasing systems and the debt peonage scheme we discussed earlier, which is just slavery with extra steps, continue to exist without any real challenges. You've seen the length of this video, you know we're not done yet. While every US history teacher will correctly tell you that Reconstruction ended in 1877, it took a few years for the reforms of that era to be dismantled. US v. Cruikshank and the Slaughterhouse cases basically gutted the 14th Amendment. Without the presence of Union troops and without action from the federal government, Southern state governments quickly stripped freedmen of all of their rights and refused to protect them from mob violence. For almost a century after the Civil War, white-on-black crime went virtually unpunished. In 1883, the Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited racial discrimination in public accommodations, like restaurants and transportation, was unconstitutional. Here's the majority opinion from that case.
When a man has emerged from slavery and by the aid of beneficent legislation has shaken off the inseparable concubines of that state, there must be some stage in the progress of his elevation when he takes the rank of a mere citizen and ceases to be the special favorite of the laws, and when his rights as a citizen or a man are to be protected in the ordinary modes by which other men's rights are protected.
Less than 20 years after the Civil War, and they're already making the "oh come on, slavery ended forever ago" argument. This decision allowed segregation at the state level. In 1892, Homer Plessy boarded a train and sat in the white section with the full intention of being arrested and challenging Louisiana's Separate Car Act. Plessy was only 1/8 black. That's one great-grandparent. And that was enough to put him in the colored section. As you're probably aware, in 1896, the Supreme Court sided with Louisiana and gave federal approval for segregation to become the norm across the country. Even the North was on board with segregation at this point. You see, before the Civil War, the racial hierarchy had been justified using the Bible, It had been ordained by God. Have you ever wondered why there's a Southern Baptist church? Because in 1845, they broke away from the rest of the Baptists over the issue of slavery and the teaching that God stained their skin black as a permanent mark of servitude. Southern ministers told the slaves that theirs was a glorified place among the chickens and the pigs. In 1859, Darwin came out with his book On the Origin of Species, and it didn't take long for amateur scientists to start measuring skulls and determining which race was superior. Care to guess which one they chose? This was the beginning of the eugenics movement. It's sometimes difficult to remember that all of these things were happening at the same time. And during the 1870s, the Indian Wars were in full swing, which spawned an entire genre of literary fiction which told fantastic tales of white men civilizing the West. Manifest Destiny provided Americans with an idealized view of white progress. And then, to top it all off, Northerners were bombarded with the news out of the South regarding an apparent crime wave following the abolition of slavery. This was a result of the Black Codes, which were presented as neutral, while the freedmen were presented as violent criminals. If you were to ask a white Northerner to describe a black person in the 1850s, before the Civil War, they would have used words like loyal, dutiful, reliable, hardworking, and trustworthy. While still servile in nature, I hope we can agree that these are mostly positive traits. By the 1890s, when convict leasing and debt peonage were widely practiced, they were a threat, uncivilized, demonic, a lascivious beast roaming the country. This is it. If you learn nothing else from this video, I want this to be it. Southern whites used laws like vagrancy, trespassing, and false pretense to convince Northern whites that black people were incapable of living in civilized society. This is where the myth of black criminality comes from. This is decades before the war on drugs. If that doesn't piss you off, I want you to take out your phone, turn on the camera, flip it to selfie mode, and then ask yourself why that is. My guess is it's because none of the history I've talked about so far would have ever applied to you. Given all of that, is it really that much of a surprise that when Birth of a Nation was released in 1915, everyone, North and South, bought its message? This was the first feature-length American film and quickly became the first Hollywood blockbuster. In the film, the abolition of slavery is depicted as a mistake, unleashing animalistic black men on our unsuspecting, innocent white women. The KKK are the heroes, swooping in to save the South and restore order. This confirmed the story that white people wanted to hear and turned the defeat of the Confederacy into a tale of martyrdom. This rewrite of American history is known as the Lost Cause and is still pushed by textbooks today. This movie is also directly responsible for the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, who began terrorizing black families by burning crosses on their lawns. The original KKK didn't do that. That was invented by the movie. I told you wouldn't believe what brought them back. Frederick Douglass died in 1895, which meant that the most influential black leader was now Booker T. Washington, who pushed a more gradualist message. He urged black people to accommodate white demands for subservience while building up their skills. He told them to learn a trade to hold the keys to their own advancement and not move up north. Don't worry, white people will come around eventually. Needless to say, this message was praised by many Southern whites. By 1901, they had gradually disenfranchised every black person in the South by passing laws and writing new state constitutions. They obviously couldn't ban an entire race from voting because of the 15th Amendment. Instead, they instituted poll taxes and literacy tests to accomplish the same goal. You all know about these, even PragerU mentions them. But just like the Black Codes, you probably have a very watered down understanding of them. Let's start with the literacy tests. Nearly every state required you to know how to read and write if you wanted to vote, which sounds reasonable on the surface, right? Here's an actual literacy test from the state of Louisiana. It starts off with some fairly straightforward questions. Draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence, cross out the longest word, circle the first letter of the alphabet. Simple. But then you get to number 10. In the first circle below, write the last letter of the first word beginning with L. What? Number 12. Draw a line from circle 2 to circle 5 that will pass below circle 2 and above circle Come on, this is only the first page. There are 30 total questions and one wrong answer denotes failure of this test. Now, be honest. Is that what you thought a literacy test was when you learned about it in school? Because I'm willing to bet this was never explained to you. These tests were arbitrarily given out to anyone who couldn't prove a 5th grade education, and the questions were just vague enough that any answer could be subjectively wrong. Many states also put up financial barriers to voting. Mississippi required a poll tax of $3, which is just over $100 in today's money. Would you vote if it cost you that much to do it every time? I doubt it. Virginia's was only $1, but you had to be paying it for each of the previous 3 years before you could vote. Louisiana required you to own at least $300 in property, but included an exemption for anyone who could vote on January 1st, 1867, or their descendants. This is the origin of the phrase grandfather clause. This loophole was intended to let poor white people vote even if they didn't meet the literacy or financial requirements, as long as their grandfather was allowed to vote. Virtually no black people were voting in the South in 1867, so their descendants didn't qualify. Disenfranchisement has several knock-on effects that you might not immediately think about. It's a lot more than just your ability to vote. You'll also find it near impossible to run for office. This obviously meant that there were no black representatives in state or federal government, which is why the nice PragerU lady stopped counting them in 1900. But this also affected local office. There were no black sheriffs, constables, or justices of the peace. Not being registered to vote also means that you couldn't be called for jury duty, so black defendants were almost always tried and convicted by all-white juries. By the time Birth of a Nation and Woodrow Wilson came around, black people had been almost entirely pushed out of government. Confederate statues were being put up in the North and South, and the Lost Cause had completely taken over the historical narrative. Race riots occurred in places like Springfield, Illinois, Charleston, South Carolina, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. Lynching had become so popular that children were let out of school early so they could attend, and newspapers advertised the event days beforehand. People took selfies with the deceased and left with souvenirs and postcards. The violence around the country got so bad that in 1936, Victor Green began publishing the Negro Motorist's Green Book, a travel guide with a list of hotels, gas stations, and barbershops that are friendly to black people in every city. They were working on a fictional version of this in the first season of Lovecraft Country. This was based on a real thing. These were printed all the way through the Civil Rights Movement and ended in 1966. Think about what that means for a moment. This country was so hostile to black people that for 3 decades, they needed to have their own separate travel guide where every listed location had to be vetted for safety, because if you went into the wrong town, you might disappear forever.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
If you're wondering what FDR has to do with slavery, I'm guessing you've forgotten the primary question of this video. Again, after giving that speech, President Roosevelt asked his cabinet what the enemy was going to use against the United States in the coming propaganda war. The answer was the treatment of the Negro. In addition to disenfranchisement and segregation, the convict leasing debt peonage system was still holding thousands of people in bondage. A man named Charles Bledsoe pled guilty to peonage in Mobile, Alabama in October 1941. Just 2 months before Pearl Harbor. America could hardly claim the moral high ground or point fingers at how Japan was treating the Chinese or Koreans when we had our own subjugated underclass. So on December 12, 1941, FDR's Justice Department issued Circular 3591.
A summary of the department files on alleged peonage violations discloses numerous instances of prosecution denied by United States attorneys, the main reason stated as being the absence of the element of debt. In the matter of control by one over the person of another, the circumstances under which each person is placed must be determined, i.e., the subservience of the will of one to the other. Open force, threats, or intimidation need not be used to cause a person to go involuntarily from one place to another to work and to remain at such work, nor does evidence of kind treatment show an absence of involuntary servitude. In the United States, one cannot sell himself as a peon or a slave. The law is fixed and established to protect the weak-minded, the poor, the miserable. Men will sometimes sell themselves for a meal of victuals, or contract with another who acts as surety on his bond to work out the amount of the bond upon his release from jail. Any such contract is positively null and void, and the procuring and causing of such contract to be made violates the law. To assure emphasis on the issue of involuntary servitude and slavery in considering these cases, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has been requested to change the title on its reports from peonage to read Involuntary Servitude and Slavery.
This memo told prosecutors to stop trying these cases under the federal anti-peonage statute because so many people were using the same defense as John W. Pace, that since the debt wasn't real, this wasn't peonage, it was slavery. And slavery wasn't a crime. They were told to stop calling it peonage and start calling it what it is, slavery. The memo provided them with a list of other statutes that could apply and told them to aggressively prosecute these crimes as part of the war effort. Over the next few months, dozens of cases would be opened across the country. In September 1942, on a farm outside of Beeville, Texas, a man named Alfred Irving became the last chattel slave to be freed in America. Not indentured servant or convict laborer or debt peon, slave. Here's a news article from the Times saying as much. The Skrabarczyk family held him as a slave for at least 4 years. They starved him and beat him with chains, whips, and ropes so regularly that he was permanently disfigured. The family was found guilty and sentenced to federal prison. The Corpus Christi Times said that the trial and its conclusion will undoubtedly be said in the future to have given a decisive setback to the enemy propaganda machine. So, in a way, by bombing Pearl Harbor, the Japanese ended slavery in the United States. When people notice the obvious inequality in our country and wonder why Black people haven't caught up yet despite slavery ending over 150 years ago, they're wrong. It ended 80 years ago. When was the last slave freed in America? It wasn't after the Civil War, it was during World War II in September 1942. Our current president, Joe Biden, was born 2 months later. Until he graduated from college, Black people had to drink out of a separate water fountain. Segregation didn't end until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Jim Crow ended with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed Black people to vote again. But just a few years after that, Nixon came along with his war on drugs, which disenfranchised and imprisoned even more Black people. On purpose. My police militarization video goes into more detail, but if you don't believe me.
The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Why haven't we done reparations? We clearly owe them. And by we, I don't mean white people. I mean the government of the United States. Since the colonial days, the laws of this country have been used to force Black people into a permanent underclass. For the first 100 years after independence, the Constitution not only allowed, but protected slavery. And immediately after it was abolished, the criminal justice system was used as leverage to extract as much labor and wealth out of Black people as possible, either directly by sentencing them to hard labor in the coal mines, or indirectly by issuing an exorbitant fine that was then paid for by a plantation owner who held that debt over them while simultaneously increasing it so it took years to pay off. If they tried to leave, they'd be arrested for breaking a labor contract and given even more hard labor. This blatantly unjust system created generations of people who rightfully fear going out alone and have learned not to expect help from the authorities. They don't trust the police and have lost all faith in the criminal justice system. And who can blame them? For almost 100 years, the primary purpose of the judicial system was to coerce Black people into meeting the labor demands and social customs of the white majority. This created a century-old myth about Black criminality that persists to this day. The government of the United States did that, not some slave owners who died over 150 years ago, and they arguably continue to do it with the war on drugs. Joe Biden was instrumental in introducing the modern version of pig laws when he was in the Senate. We went from slave codes and chattel slavery to Black codes and neo-slavery, which is convict leasing and debt peonage, to the war on drugs and the prison industrial complex. It's basically a continuum of oppression against Black people. This version of history, otherwise known as What Actually Happened, explains much more about the current state of racial inequality in our country than the standard American history myth we were all taught. Have you noticed I haven't shown you a PragerU clip in the last half hour? Because this part of the story is almost always skipped over. We learn about the Pilgrims, the Revolution, the Civil War, And that's pretty much it. You'll eventually learn about segregation and how Martin Luther King ended racism.
Also in our time, all Americans are equally protected under the law and have equal voting rights regardless of race.
We even had a black president.
2 terms.
Today, America is the most successful multiracial country in history. The only white majority country to elect a black president twice.
PragerU is basically presenting the same version of history that we all learned in elementary and high school. The only difference is that their target audience consists entirely of adults, specifically parents. They're pushing for school choice, so they're trying to scare parents into believing their kids are learning critical race theory or that America is a racist country. But I can assure you, no child is learning about anything I've talked about during this video. There are history and social studies teachers watching this right now who have never heard about debt peonage before. I know I hadn't when I was a teacher. Finally learning about this stuff has given me a serious crisis of conscience. I was taught the standard American history myth, which is just a watered down version of the lost cause, and then I helped spread that narrative to the next generation of kids. As an educator, there is nothing worse than realizing you've been teaching a lie, even if it's only a lie by omission. The full story makes so much more sense that I wish this stuff was taught in school, because then we might actually demand some changes, which is exactly why PragerU keeps telling you the same story you learned in 5th grade. History is the only subject where they repeatedly say you shouldn't learn anything new, because then you might feel bad about being white or American. You learned everything you need to know about history in elementary school. I don't feel any guilt for being white, but I do feel guilty that I believed the fairy tale version of American history for so long. At least now I know better, and so do you. Now that you know all this, it's time to confront your implicit racial biases, which you can do over at curiositystream.com/knowingbetter. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and nonfiction titles that you can access across multiple platforms. Are you racist? Find out by watching the show, Are You Racist?, which ran multiple subjects through a battery of psychological tests to reveal subconscious prejudices against certain other people. Do you think some people are just genetically more likely to commit crime? This documentary is for you. Check it out by heading over to curiositystream.com/knowingbetter, where you can also get access to Nebula, the streaming service built by fellow YouTubers to escape the unjust rules of the algorithm. All of my content is hosted over there ad-free, and most of my recent videos include special content that can only be seen on Nebula. Sign up today by heading over to curiositystream.com/knowingbetter, where you can get access to both CuriosityStream and Nebula for only $14.79 a year. You'll also be supporting the channel when you do. I'm not going to apologize for the length of this video or the delay in its release, because you've come to expect that by now. I'd like to give a shout out to my newest Golden Fork patrons, Adam and Specialist Angel Figueroa. If you'd like to add your name to this list of debt peons, head on over to patreon.com/knowingbetter, or for a one-time donation, paypal.me/knowingbetter. Don't forget to emancipate that subscribe button or the join button if you're an abolitionist. Check out the merch at knowingbetter.tv, follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and join us on the subreddit.